All right. This is Mac Bolan. And I am broadcasting tonight for believers and non-believers group discussion. Tonight, I'm going to cover something that's been up and down in the media for quite a while now. I want to talk about Russia. And specifically, I want to talk about Russia in relation to the U.S., the Cold War, and I'll go back in history, kind of give a background, and then bring us to where we're at with relations with Russia right now. So, going back in history, just to kind of give a background, and I don't want to go too far back. Russia, for a long time, was a very backwards country. Ethnically Slavic nation for the most part, and didn't really start to become a power on the world scene until Peter the Great. They had a very long-standing fight, you could say, with the Western culture, and then on top of that with the Turks. And Slavs and Turks, and when I say Slavs, I'm talking about a whole group, what's modern day Czechoslovakia, used to be Yugoslavia, an ethnic group. And they were at odds with the Turks for a long time in Russia, in the Balkans. Russia really didn't become an empire until after Peter the Great, Catherine, the Tsars. For those who don't know, the Russian dynasty became the Tsars were the Romanovs. You'll see the Nicholases, Alexandria. Anyway, got to the point where they even fought a war with the Turks, the Crimean War. But let's go ahead and fast forward now to World War I. Now, World War I was a huge turning point in Russian history because basically they got their asses handed to them by the Germans. They dropped out of the war in World War I. There was a lot of problems brewing within the country, between the ruling class, between what was called back then the bourgeois and the Tsars. And after Russia's exit from the war, a revolution started. Now, a lot of this was based on teachings and a philosophy adopted by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, based on teachings and their adoption of communism and Marx's Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital. I could go on and on about how the philosophy developed. Anyway, the Civil War, the revolution broke out shortly after World War I ended. Then, after the revolution, and the Bolsheviks, who eventually ended up murdering the Tsar and his entire family, a civil war started. The Civil War was between the Bolsheviks and, you could say, maybe quasi-democratic movement, which were identified as the White Russians, the Bolsheviks, the Red Russians. Interesting to note that for the White Russians, the people opposing the Bolsheviks, they were strongly identified with the bourgeois, with the wealthy, with the ruling class, versus the Bolsheviks, who identified with the peasants, with the working class. And very, very little known fact, and something that happened that probably went a long ways towards developing what we call Russian paranoia. Now, Russia had already been invaded by Napoleon, which failed. Interesting book called 17 Flags. And basically what happened during the Russian Civil War, numerous countries sent aid, supplies, money, and even troops to support the White Russians. And this was seen, as an outside force intervening within the Russian Civil War. And the Bolsheviks were able to use this to their advantage. Of course, we all know, based on history, in the end, the Bolsheviks won. Russia became a communist country, at the time being run by Lenin and Trotsky. Now, if you go through, when Lenin died, he was worried about Stalin. Stalin was kind of the guy in the shadows. He, after Lenin's death, was able to capitalize on it, and he took power. Trotsky was eventually murdered and taken out of the equation. And here's where things really kind of go south for Russia. Stalin immediately instituted, to try and modernize Russia, catch him up, his 5-year plans. These were economic plans which were absolutely brutal, resulted in the deaths of millions of people. They ended up in gulags. It was a very, very strict regime. A lot of the peoples were persecuted. Ironically, Stalin believed in Russification, and even though he was a Georgian, much like, Hitler believed in German nationalization, but he was an Austrian. And during this time frame, a lot of groups were persecuted, particularly like the Yiddish, who were the Russian Jews. So let's fast forward now to World War II. Prior to the outbreak of World War II, the Soviet Union, Russia, it wasn't the Soviet Union, Russia signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, with Hitler. And a lot of people who are ignorant of history don't realize that in 1939, in September 1939, when World War II broke out, Germany and Russia both invaded Poland. It wasn't just Germany. Russia also invaded Poland. And in fact, Russia, which was denied for many years, was responsible for the K-10 forest massacre of Polish officers. Denied for many years, but, the truth finally came out. At the same time, Russia invaded Finland, fought the Russo-Finnish War, also known as the Winter War. Then eventually, of course, we all know, Hitler turned around after fighting the Battle of Britain and invaded Russia. And of course, Stalin never trusted Hitler, and Hitler never trusted Stalin. So they, even though they had the non-aggression pact, it was kind of like Stalin eventually knew that eventually Hitler would be coming. Ironically, initially when the German forces entered Russia, a lot of the peoples in Georgia and the Ukraine, etc., welcomed the Nazis as liberators. They hated Stalin. Stalin had been punishing the country for years. But because of Hitler's racial policies, because he treated, again, a lot of people know about the extermination of around 6 million Jews. He also killed about 4 to 5 million other peoples, because he considered Slavs, Hungarians, etc., as Untermensch, lower people. So he applied the same policies against them, and was responsible for their deaths. Now, interesting to note, General Patton, who was a student of history, supported the U.S. strategy of actually continuing the campaign through Italy and coming up through the underbelly of Europe, because he didn't trust the Russians, and rightfully so. He knew his history. He knew Stalin. He knew what could possibly come. Of course, Eisenhower had the policy of France first. We went in on Normandy. Problem is, when Russia got to Germany first and took all those countries and occupied them, this was kind of the beginning of the Cold War, because we turned around right after the defeat of Germany and Japan, and now there was the new threat with Russia, which eventually formed the Soviet Union and occupied and controlled all those countries. You had the Berlin airlift, you had the forming of the Warsaw Pact, the forming of NATO, and the beginning of the Cold War. During this time frame, both countries now, U.S. had the nuclear capability, Russia was able to gain the nuclear capability. The term MAD, which means mutually assured destruction, came about. Now, I grew up during this time period, 60s, 70s. The Cold War at its height, we did things like air raid drills. There were marked bomb shelters in the bottom of churches. You did stuff like get underneath your chair in the event of a nuclear strike. So it was real. I mean, during that time frame, the fear of a world war, a nuclear war, back then was a real deal. So now I want to talk a little bit about Cold War politics, because this is it's interesting, because I want to really talk about both sides, because a lot of people don't know both sides of what went on during the Cold War. Okay, we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1961 in October. The Russians were sending missiles, were building missile bases in Cuba. Castro, after the revolution, sided with the communists, was receiving aid from Russia. And the interesting thing to note, the Russian response was primarily based on Turkey, one, joining NATO, and then air bases that were built in Turkey by NATO. And, I've been to a few of them, was stationed there for a while during another operation involving Iraq, different story, different war, but Russia saw the bases in Turkey as a threat. They took advantage of the situation, and they decided to try and build, missile bases in Cuba. Of course, if you get a chance, go online, read about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Very fascinating, how the world literally sat on edge when President Kennedy instituted a blockade, drew a line, and basically told the Russians, if you send your ships over this line, we're going to sink them. Backdoor diplomacy ended up working. The fighting, any potential war was averted, and the Cold War continued. Now, during the Cold War, and this is interesting because a lot of people talk about events like in Chile, and you'll hear the U.S. being vilified over Pinochet, who admittedly, Pinochet in Chile was a extremely corrupt dictator, murderous. But what you don't hear mentioned is the fact that the guy he replaced, Allende, was the same guy, only he was a Russian puppet. So if you could say, Pinochet was a bastard, well, you know what? He was our bastard. He wasn't the Russian bastard that Allende was. Same thing happened in Iran. Russia manipulated and basically controlled an election that put their puppet in place in Iran, and the U.S. turned around and supported a coup by the Shah, and he took control in Iran. Again, you got to know both sides of the story. All these games that were being played during the Cold War, there were two sides to it. The Russians were heavily involved, and the U.S. responded, doing kind of the same thing. And then, of course, we had Vietnam. The U.S. got involved in Vietnam, and the U.S. And the Russians, of course, supported the North Vietnamese, as did China. Interesting note, in 1973, and I'm going to talk about the Middle East here in Israel. Okay, Russia got involved in supporting Egypt and Syria. Gave them money. They in Egypt, and Assad, the older Assad, not the one that's in charge now, in Syria, to the point to where they armed them, gave them modern equipment, and did everything they could to support them to get a hand in the Middle East. Now, the conflict there obviously was raging between Israel, the lone Jewish state, and the sea of all the Islamic states, and had already fought a war in 1967, had fought a war in 1947 when they declared their independence. And so now in 1973, the armies of Syria and Egypt, supported by the Soviets, invaded Israel in a surprise attack. And it was a huge battle, because initially the forces of Egypt and Syria, with all this modern Soviet equipment and tanks, machine guns, rockets, anti-tank missiles, initially gained the momentum, and it looked like Israel was almost on the brink of destruction. And the U.S. immediately got involved. They supported Israel. The Israeli jets that had been given to them by the U.S. played a huge role in this. And eventually, when the tide turned, at one point, again, the world's on edge, looking at, is the U.S. and the Soviet Union going to get involved in this minor conflict in the Middle East? And is this going to lead to World War III? And both powers were heavily involved in this particular war, 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Now, Israel did prevail. And in fact, they got to the point where they pushed all the way across the Sinai back into Egypt, and were on the outskirts of Cairo, and pushed all the way into Syria, and were on the outskirts of Damascus when, panic and everything else prevailed, and a armistice was signed, and Israel, of course, gained the territory, gained the Sinai, gained the West Bank after the outcome of that. So now we'll go ahead and fast forward. Go to the 1980s. Now, this time it's the Soviets who, managed to. President Carter came into office as an idealist, with, naive, an idealist, a politician, who wanted to bring all these gains, wanted to bring peace. The problem is he set a tone for very weak diplomacy. He was totally taken advantage of by the Russians. And after a summit, where he signed a strategic arms limitation package, the Russians turned around and totally ignored it, and then invaded Afghanistan, which, of course, led to the absurd boycott of the 1980 Olympics, which basically did nothing except make the Russians and their allies boycott the 1984 Olympics in LA. But they invaded Afghanistan. Carter loses the election. Reagan comes into office. Reagan immediately, after grasping the situation, realizes, okay, how long can they sustain their occupation in Afghanistan, and how long can they sustain an economic system that U.S. intelligence analysts by the mid-'80s were saying, hey, failing. They were absolutely failing. They are on the verge of collapse. So Reagan instituted basically an arms race, what they called the Star Wars, and the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars. And then on top of that, started supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviet occupation. Eventually, Russia pulled out of Afghanistan. course, right after that, a civil war started in Afghanistan, and that's something I could cover on another podcast, between the Northern Alliance and the Taliban, whole other story. At this point, the Soviet Union economically is on the brink of collapse. They can no longer control all those other countries. And then Reagan makes his trip to Berlin, makes his famous speech. Of course, the guy who comes in, Gorbachev, replacing some of the hardliners in the past, like Yuri Andropov, sees the problems and comes in as a moderate, looking to work out a deal, they talked about glasnost, perestroika, policies that would bring him closer and in better ties with Europe and the U.S. And of course, again, Reagan makes his speech. Shortly thereafter, the, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, probably one of the greatest speeches in, U.S. presidential history. The USSR collapses. Now, shortly after that, there's a coup attempt by the Russian hardliners. And a little known fact, Putin was kind of, he was involved but not involved and sat on the sidelines. He was a member of KGB at this time. And the Russian coup attempt failed. 2 or 3 of the guys behind it eventually committed suicide. And we have this huge era of great relations between Russia and, make no mistake, when I say the Soviet Union collapsed, I mean it went down. Everything broke away. The old Soviet flag went down. The Russian tricolor came back. The tricolor flag, the previous cities that were named Stalingrad and Leningrad got their original names back to Kiev and St. Petersburg. And a lot of the statues of Lenin and Stalin were pulled down and looked like, Russia had made a complete turnaround. Relations were great. And then the guy who came in after Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, was also, we had great relations. So now, looking back on that, what happened? Why are we now stuck with Putin? Well, the start of this was basically the death of Tito and the breakup of Yugoslavia. Civil War started, Croatia broke off, Serbia, and then Bosnia. And then came the fighting in Bosnia. And this is where it all went south in a hurry. First off, basically the civil war in Bosnia was a culmination of bad blood that had built up over years and years and years between the ethnic Slavs, the Serbians, and Muslims. Interesting to note that in World War II, both Croatia and Bosnia Muslims formed SS units fighting with Germany for Hitler. And Serbia, which had the partisans, which were strongly supported by Russia, very strong ties with Serbia, against Hitler. And the what was called in Yugoslavia back then, Tito was in charge of the partisans. He was allied with the Soviet Union. The Chetniks were allied with Hitler. Now, it's important to note because when the United Nations mission in Bosnia failed miserably, like a lot of United Nations missions do, they fail miserably because the United Nations is a weak and inefficient and absurd organization. Probably should go away at some point, or at least be restructured. NATO took over. Now, this is significant again because when the Warsaw Pact fell apart and the Soviet Union broke up, a lot of those countries that were controlled by Russia before and still had, a lot of people, when I was in Estonia, for instance, in the Baltic republics, who've been, raped and brutalized by Russia for years as part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union broke up, a lot of the Russians in those countries had nowhere to go. They couldn't go back to Russia because they had no jobs, they had no family, and they were stuck in these countries. I was in Estonia working with their military, and most of their military was full of Russians. Their officers, their battalion commanders, their company commanders were all Russian. A lot of their soldiers were, but they had nowhere to go, so they had to stay. So no more Warsaw Pact. Russia kind of on its own. And like I said, again, a paranoid nation that has endured, invasions, etc. So NATO takes over in Bosnia. You had the massacre at Srebrenica, a lot of problems. But at this time, Clinton comes into office, and the Clinton administration, with a complete failure in grasping the history and the politics of the situation. Now, on the one hand, he's not fighting in the Middle East. He's not dealing with Iraq or Saddam Hussein or Afghanistan or Al-Qaeda, but turns around and probably makes one of the worst foreign policy decisions in U.S. history. And make no mistake, when I say this was bad, it was like, incomprehensible bad. I mean, he pulled something that was so boneheaded. Basically, Clinton came in and said that NATO would be involved in Bosnia purely for humanitarian reasons. Now, this turned out to be a huge, huge lie. Shortly thereafter, he authorized the U.S. and NATO to institute a bombing campaign in Serbia, targeting not just military targets, but the capital of Serbia, Belgrade itself. Now, if you haven't read any of this, it's because it never got a lot of attention in the media. But go ahead and Google the phrase "Clinton lied, Yugoslavia died," and see what you pull up. Because when the U.S. and NATO began bombing Serbia, and they didn't just bomb, they dropped anti-personnel mines all over the country. To this day, there are still people, mostly civilians, women, children, who get maimed or killed by anti-personnel mines that were dropped all over the country by the U.S. and NATO in Serbia for no good goddamn reason. None. That part of that situation was no threat to the U.S. There was no logical reason for Clinton to involve NATO and the U.S. in the Balkans, and the side effect of it was a shock by Russians who have had, like I mentioned before, very strong ties throughout history with the Serbs, who are Slavs, and they say they share the same ethnicity. And you're talking about a people that fought with the Russians against the Germans in World War II, had been their strong allies back when Tito ran Yugoslavia. Even though he was not aligned, he was an ally with the Soviet Union. And during a time we should have been focusing on the Middle East, we not only got our eye off the Middle East, getting involved in the Balkans and in Bosnia, but in one simple action, Clinton managed to piss away all the years and years of goodwill built up between the U.S. and Russia that existed through Reagan and the Bush years. And that is why you had a turn in Russian politics. That is what led to the eventual rise and taking of power of Putin. He was able to play into Russian nationalism. He was able to expose the threat the U.S. and NATO basically presented. And then, of course, shortly after Putin came to power, go back to around 2008, they invaded Georgia because of the East Ossetia incident. And then down the road, of course, came the eventual fighting with the Ukraine, which at the time had the third or fourth largest army in Europe. Well, Eastern Europe, and only behind Russia. But you're talking about an objective which he'd always had his eyes on because of the standing army there. And the main thing was the Crimean Peninsula offered them a warm water port, a huge navy, and an enlarged presence, within that area. So he goes in, invades, annexes the Crimea, and of course, at the time, ironically, Obama's president does nothing. And speaking of Obama, it's almost laughable back during the 2012 election when he sat there and he ridiculed Mitt Romney about the potential Russian threat, and then turns around and wasn't able to do a damn thing about it. So that kind of gives us a background to where we're at now with the Russian relations. Syria. Russia got involved in Syria. We got involved in Syria. And that's another epic Obama foreign policy mess up that I could speak volumes on. Now, I want to talk a little bit about current Russian relations, and I want to talk a little bit about the 2016 election and kind of what's going on right now. I want to go back, during the Obama administration, after the 2012 election, he told Putin, oh, well, don't worry, I'll be a little more flexible after the election. And of course, everything that happened, and suddenly he realized he got his underwear pulled over his head. But at the same time, they made a uranium deal with Russia. Now, for whatever reason, this was never investigated the way it should have been. There was a huge donation to the Clinton Foundation by Russia, and suddenly this uranium deal goes down. Same time, the Clinton email server, she had illegally stored classified material on, lied about it, should have been prosecuted. Her server was hacked, probably 4 or 5 times, Russians definitely being one. Now, the AG at the time, the FBI at the time, never really went into this heavily. And in fact, when Clinton should have been prosecuted over this, was not. But now we talk about Trump. Everybody ridiculed Trump when he talked about him being wiretapped. And, as it turns out, of course, it was true. He was being wiretapped. You go back to the 2016 election and a investigation that began back in July of 2016 based on supposed Trump campaign members' ties to Russia. Let's say like Manafort. Well, yeah, business ties, and they were openly disclosed. There was nothing being hidden there. This is being pursued, and they try and talk about Russian collusion in the election, yet to this point, there is not a single piece of evidence. This is an investigation that's been going on since July. Trump fires Comey. Within his rights. No crime committed. He can appoint or fire anyone in those positions. I wonder if they had spent as much time and effort that they're doing right now trying to find some hypothetical connection between the Trump campaign and Russia and some kind of collusion, which they still haven't found any evidence on, versus if they'd have maybe applied the same vigor towards going after Hillary Clinton and the things that she was guilty of, versus something that there's no evidence on. I wonder what the outcome might have been. Anyway, the current, I'm just trying to give you a background. This is where we're at with the current relations between the U.S. and Russia. And if Trump can do anything to better relations with Russia, fine. No, Putin's not our friend. and Russia's not our ally, but they weren't back in the 80s either. And given the opportunity, President Reagan was able to establish those relations. The question is, will Trump or any U.S. president following be able to gain good relations with Russia again? So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Again, this is Mac Boland just trying to give a background and understanding for those of you who may not know it regarding Russia, U.S. relations, the Cold War, and where we're at now. Have a good night.